Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our quarterly webinar, where my colleagues and I will be discussing our latest research. My name's Chris, and I'm on the engagement team here at Planet Tracker. As always, we have quite a packed agenda for today, and we are happy to see so many of you dialing in for this session. In the next 30 minutes or so, we will discuss some of the latest research we have published. So we will compare the toxic chemical release reporting requirements between the US and the EU and some of the risks that could be financially material for investors. We'll also discuss whether deep sea mining will bring financial benefits to countries. And lastly, we'll look at the latest report from our climate transition analysis series examining Air Liquide's climate transition strategy. Now, before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, please do add them into the Q&A. We'll try and pick them up here, but if we can't, then we'll get back to you after the webinar via email. Please note that we will only be able to follow up with those who do not submit anonymously. Alternatively, you can feel free to sort of reach out to us at the end. I've got our contact details, so that's an alternative for you. Also, just to note that links to all the available reports discussed today will be shared in the chat box, so you don't have to search for them online. And lastly, this webinar is recorded, so we'll be sharing it with everybody afterwards. Now, before we kick in, I just want I wanted to take 1 minute to introduce Planet Tracker to those of you who aren't familiar with our work. So Planet Tracker is a sustainable finance think tank conducting research on nature-related risks and opportunities. We focus on the drivers of biodiversity loss, specifically land and sea use change, exploitation of natural resources, pollution, and climate change. We provide in-depth research reports on each of these topics, covering a range of industries and themes, as you can see on the slide here. We're not for profit, so everything we do is for the common good, and all of our research is publicly available on our website or on your usual financial data platforms. So with that being said, let's dive into the webinar. The first piece of research that will be discussed is going to be published later this week, and it's a report that compares the toxic chemical release reporting requirements between the US and the EU. With me is my colleague Richard, who heads up our plastics and petrochemical work. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. So our Tale of Two Systems report builds on the analyses we've published previously looking at corporate and investor toxic footprints in both the US Gulf states and the EU trilateral region. I encourage you to take a look at those reports on our website. They're the European toxic footprints and the US toxic footprints reports and the interactive data dashboards that go alongside them. And as Chris mentioned, all our research is available for free on our website. Now, here at Planet Tracker, we've published a number of reports highlighting what we see as the growing risk to the plastics and chemicals industry and why investors should be considering these risks in the valuations of exposed corporates. The production and release of toxic chemicals is an important driver for the risk register we see. As we show on this slide, academic research into the toxic effects of chemicals is growing rapidly. You can see that on the right, a really sort of enormous growth in research being published in the last sort of 10 to 20 years. Regulators and consumers are increasingly aware of the impacts man-made chemicals can have on environmental and human health. And importantly, even though academic research is growing fast, it struggles to keep up with the rate of new chemical synthesis. There's an average of around 1.4, a new chemical entity registered every 1.4 minutes. So every day we're pumping out hundreds and hundreds of new chemicals, which we just don't really know much about. Now, these unknown chemicals add to what we see as the black box of risk this industry is exposed to, and of course, the investors are exposed to. Will growing awareness of toxic impacts represent a reputational risk to investors and corporates? Will we see regulators increasingly stepping in, perhaps in response to consumer pressure? Or will it threaten market access for those who are producing chemicals that are deemed too toxic? What about litigation risk? Is the industry sitting on a financial time bomb as the evidence for human health harms begins to really pile up? So in our Tale of Two Systems report, we compare the toxic release reporting requirements between the US and the EU. And we examine areas of difference and question why a chemical would be considered worthy of reporting upon in one region and maybe not in the other. Now, first takeaway is that there is a material difference in the way toxic chemicals are regulated between the two regions. The EU uses what is termed a hazard-based approach. The hazard of a chemical considers all the potential sources of danger or harm it could cause. For instance, a chemical could cause lung damage. That would be a hazard of that chemical. This would not imply that any level of exposure, no matter how small and received by any means, will cause land damage. The EU approach can be considered as probably more precautionary, stricter, and more burdensome for corporates. However, it may come with upside of reducing future litigation risk because of that precautionary principle. In comparison, the US uses what's termed a risk-based approach, where hazardous chemicals are regulated based on an assessment of the likelihood of harm, the risk of harm. Using the example of a chemical that causes lung damage, as I was mentioning earlier, a risk assessment would quantify the risk of lung damage based on the level of exposure needed. The risk might be considered insignificant if, for instance, you had to ingest kilos of that chemical to cause the hazard. Now, acknowledging this difference in approach, somewhat surprisingly, the US would seem to be more prescriptive in its regulation of chemicals than the EU. Whilst the EU pollutant transfer register requires reporting on 91 different line items, the US toxic release inventory, which is a sort of equivalent, requires reporting on 721. So a really material difference. Now, in the report, we discuss some reasons we believe we might see this difference and why this seemingly counterintuitive situation may be explained. So moving to the investor takeaways from the report and the body of work we've done with toxic footprints. Firstly, I'd say we believe investors should welcome a strong regulatory framework as it helps to mitigate against future risk, be that litigation or otherwise. Although it might be tempting for corporates to chase and try and practice regulatory arbitrage, moving production to regions with lower enforcement, we think that stalls up future risk for both the corporate and their investors. Secondly, we believe investors should push for greater transparency in this area, both from the corporates they invest in and the regulators of the sector. It remains a challenge, even after all the work we've done, to compare toxic release in the EU to the US, even for the same corporate. So comparing the nature of the releases, the type of chemicals, the way the releases are reported, it all varies. And that makes that comparison difficult, if not impossible. Investors should push for standardized reporting so they can understand where risk is concentrated, what products that might be, what plants that might be that they're most risky, and then they can start to engage on those issues with their corporates. And thank you for your attention. As Chris mentioned, the report will be out later this week.
Thanks, Richard. Now, just a quick follow-up question on this. You mentioned litigation as a risk. Are we seeing this happening already, or is this at some point in the future?
That's a good question. Helpfully, the answer is probably a bit of a mix. Now, of course, litigation around chemicals causing human health harms is not something that we have never seen before. I mean, for instance, we all probably know Bayer is a great example, having problems with glyphosate, potentially paying out a lot of money to people who've been impacted by that chemical. And we are seeing other classes of chemicals come into both the regulatory and litigation spotlight. For instance, I point to PFAS. For instance, 3M has stepped away from that sector, given what they see as a building risk register around that chemical class. Beyond that, it's interesting that where we do see litigation, particularly in the US, tends to be the most litigious area, it currently seems often to center on consumer protection rather than necessarily human health harms. So there will be an argument, for instance, if you're selling maybe natural spring water and it's got microplastics in or chemicals of concern, the consumer attempts to sue on the grounds that your product isn't natural, it isn't healthy, and therefore they've been misled. So currently, I think the human health evidence, the human health angle, if you like, is still building. Academic research is growing, as I mentioned, and that will be a key plank for future litigation risks. So we're probably thinking still a couple of years out from that wave really cresting.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. Okay. Now we're going to move on to our next topic for today, and that's on deep sea mining. And with us, we have Emma, who leads our research on this. So Emma, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and hello, everybody. So today I'm going to talk through the findings of one of our recent reports on deep sea mining, Race to the Bottom, which examines whether deep sea mining could bring financial benefits to countries in the form of taxes. So first, to take a step back, proponents of deep sea mining claim that it could offer a more environmentally friendly alternative to mining on land. However, research by Planet Tracker and others shows that deep sea mining could actually have a bigger negative impact on biodiversity and the climate than conventional mining. So in the report Race to the Bottom, we have investigated whether these environmental risks could be outweighed by the financial benefits that countries could receive from deep sea mining taxes. we focus on two key sources of government income from deep sea mining: the corporate income tax that countries sponsoring deep sea mining companies might receive, as well as the royalties that the International Seabed Authority, that's the ISA, collects from deep sea mining companies, which theoretically should be used to benefit ISA member states and humanity as a whole. So, what were our key findings? Overall, we found that countries are unlikely to see any significant direct financial benefit from deep sea mining taxes. In total, we estimate that the combined corporate income tax and royalties could provide countries with, on average, 42,000 to 7.35 million US dollars each per year, which is a trivial amount in comparison to the size of all but a few national economies. So most of this money would theoretically come from corporate income tax, which could be up to 6.25 million US dollars under the most optimistic scenario with a 25% tax rate. So how does this work? Companies have to be sponsored by a country if they want to submit an application for deep sea mining in international waters. In theory, this means that deep sea mining companies could face corporate income tax through these sponsorship agreements. However, there is a strong chance that sponsoring states will not levy any corporate income tax on these companies for a few reasons. First, sponsorship agreements already exist that include no corporate income tax altogether, for example, with Nauru. And this highlights that sponsoring states have very little bargaining power when negotiating taxes because they don't own the deep sea mineral resources, and contractors can shop around for sponsorship from any ISA member state, leading to a race to the bottom for low or no tax. Secondly, deep sea mining companies are unlikely to generate profits, as highlighted by previous Planet Tracker research, which would result in little to no tax revenues for governments. So overall, this means that governments are likely to receive no income tax from deep sea mining companies. But beyond corporate income tax, we found that countries are also likely to receive little or no money from deep sea mining royalties. And to provide context here, currently any company carrying out deep sea mining in international waters would be required to make payments to the ISA, which must share these financial benefits with its member states. On average, we estimate that each member state would receive 42,000 to 1.1 million US dollars per year from royalties. Again, an insignificant amount for most governments. Crucially, what we found here is that while the ISA could receive, on average, up to 270 million US dollars per year from royalties, a minimum of 80 million US dollars of deductions would be required, including 13 million to cover the ISA's administrative costs, as well as additional payments to an economic assistance fund for developing countries who could be negatively impacted by deep sea mining. On top of this, the ISA can make unlimited further deductions before these royalties are shared, which would reduce the amount of money available for countries to such an extent that directly distributing these funds now no longer looks like a viable option. Instead, the ISA wants to set up a central fund, most recently in the form of a common heritage fund, which would support various activities around science, ocean science, and research. And critics have highlighted that many of these activities are actually required by international law as prerequisites to deep sea mining taking place and shouldn't be seen as additional benefits to be funded by royalties of deep sea mining. So what are our recommendations for financial institutions? Through this research, we really want to stress that if deep sea mining were to take place, it would be unlikely to generate any significant financial benefits for countries in the form of royalties and taxes. On top of this, deep sea mining could cause large-scale permanent damage to deep sea ecosystems and the wider oceans with which they interact, as shown in our previous research. And really, we want financial institutions to support a moratorium on deep sea mining and engage with governments who have not yet explicitly supported such a moratorium. We also think financial institutions should develop investment or funding policies that exclude deep sea mining companies, as well as policies that support improving the environmental, social, and economic governance of terrestrial mining, which will continue regardless of whether deep sea mining takes place. And that concludes my whistle-stop tour of our latest deep sea mining work.
Thanks, Emma. And just a quick follow-up question on that. So if nobody's going to benefit from this, then why is there continued support for deep sea mining?
That's a very good question. I think that the proponents of deep sea mining genuinely believe that it would cause less environmental damage than mining on land and would open up new opportunities for mining critical minerals. However, the overwhelming majority of impartial scientific research and research from NGOs like ourselves highlights that deep sea mining will cause permanent damage on a massive scale and in one of the most biodiverse, pristine environments on the planet. And as I highlighted at the end of my presentation, deep sea mining would not stop mining on land from happening. And most estimates suggest that it would make up a maximum of 3 to 4%, maybe a bit more, of the supply of these metals. So it won't be a situation where we stop mining on land and stop harming terrestrial environments and kind of eliminate a lot of the negative or terrible kind of social practices associated with mining on land. Mining on land would still continue. So I think it's a false narrative that we must either protect habitats on land or the seabed. We should really be trying to preserve both and improve social welfare standards for mining and work conditions for mining on land. And I think that there's another argument for deep sea mining that it's needed to meet increased mineral demands for the low carbon energy transition. But there's a lot of research now that shows that circular economy strategies and new technologies, such as lithium iron phosphate, also known as LFP batteries, are already reducing demand for these metals and could do so significantly in the future, just to give one example. So, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, and now we're going to move on to our final topic for the webinar today, which is on Air Liquide's climate transition analysis, which is led by my colleague Jon. So, Jon, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to see so many of you attending our quarterly update. So today I'll be discussing Air Liquide's climate transition assessment, and we'll focus on three main areas: the key issues we identified, our findings regarding the current initiatives of the company, and our recommendations for strengthening the climate transition strategy of Air Liquide. So beginning with the key issues, first, there is a significant concern regarding Air Liquide Scope 3 emissions, more specifically its upstream Scope 3 footprint. And this is because while from 2020 to 2023, the company overall greenhouse gas emissions decreased slightly by 0.5%, the upstream Scope 3 emissions increased by 53.1%. So a considerable increase here. We find this upward trend to be problematic, especially since Air Liquide lacks specific reduction targets for these emissions. So something we will also comment on in the next slide. Second, Air Liquide has made a substantial financial commitment by allocating over 50% of its 16 billion capex investments by 2025 to what the company describes as decarbonization projects. And while we find this commendable, at least the theory behind it, there is a lack of transparency in how these investments are actually linked to measurable emission reduction outcomes. And to be fair, without clear metrics connecting capital expenditure to tangible results, shareholders cannot evaluate the effectiveness of these investments in terms of emission reductions, but also even assess if said investments are truly linked to decarbonization projects, as some of them might just be purely growth projects. And third, while Air Liquide acknowledges the significant regulatory and physical climate risks, as well as potential opportunities, in the new climate transition plan, which was released recently, the company falls short in providing detailed financial disclosure about these potential risks. So this absence, we believe, challenges investors' ability to assess the company's readiness for climate relation issues, as well as taking on those potential opportunities, and overall weakens the shareholders' confidence, I would say. If we move on to our findings, on a positive note, among the good things Air Liquide has been doing in the last few years. They have implemented strong governance and influence measures, for example, linking executive compensation to climate objectives, as well as engaging with suppliers and customers on climate issues. Also, as I was mentioning before, Air Liquide has shown awareness of the potential regulatory and physical climate risks, and this is a key first step in addressing those potential challenges going forward. We would like to see more on the second part of this. However, despite the good things they've done, as I was mentioning, the absence of specific Scope 3 emission reduction targets, we believe undermines the overall impact of these efforts, especially when it comes to the engagement with suppliers and other stakeholders. As without these targets, it is difficult and challenging to ensure accountability on company side, but also on its value chain side, and in fact measure the progress across the company's overall supply chain. Also, the lack of a clear link between decarbonization investment and quantifiable emission reduction raises question about the effectiveness of these financial commitments. And I think it would be fair for stakeholders to have a higher transparency in order to trust that these investments will yield real environmental benefits. Lastly, if we discuss our recommendation for Air Liquide, firstly, we strongly advise Air Liquide to set Scope 3 reduction targets that align with science-based pathways, ideally aligning with a 1.5-degree scenario. As you know, establishing these targets would ensure accountability across the entire value chain, but also demonstrate a genuine commitment to leading climate action. Secondly, the company should enhance transparency by clearly linking those decarbonization investments to measurable emission reduction outcomes. Sometimes this could come in a form of a range, but I do believe it's key to have that information and would also help ultimately investors on building better models for the evaluation. Also, developing and disclosing specific metrics that connect capital expenditure to emission reduction, as I was saying, would also improve the credibility of the plan and would ultimately build stronger trust. Lastly, Air Liquide should provide a quantitative assessment of the climate-related financial risk in their climate transition plan, because this is the level of transparency that is needed for the stakeholders to fully assess the company's resilience and also preparedness when it comes to climate challenges. So in short, just to recapitulate, I would say that yes, it's true, Air Liquide has made some notable strides in the last few years, but there are still some critical gaps that need to be addressed in order to be at the front of climate transition as a leading company. And setting specific Scope 3 targets is key in enhancing transparency and also improving the investment outcomes, because providing detailed financial disclosure on climate risks would help better valuations. Also, Air Liquide can significantly strengthen its climate strategy by doing that. And as I said, this step would not only align the company with a 1.5 pathway, but would also reinforce that trust and commitment that the company is presenting. Thank you all for your attention. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, John. Now, a frequent question that tends to pop up when we engage with stakeholders is, what is the company's argument for not setting Scope 3 targets?
So, well, in our engagement with the company, Air Liquide would usually argue that most of the material Scope 3 categories lack what is a globally agreed methodology and specific data. So to explain that, what they mean is that most of these methodologies and data rely on statistics, such as the spend base for procurement, for example, or the grid average data for energy and so on. So the company is basically saying that the figures variation would mostly depend on global averages evolution rather than Air Liquide's specific profile now. So they, in a way, do not find relevant to have a target on Scope 3 emission until the methodology either improve or are more agreed on, or there is access to more specific data. In our opinion, I'm going to be honest, I think this is a weak excuse, especially because Air Liquide is one of the leading chemical companies out there. They have a lot of capable people working for the company. And even when you rely on statistics, I do believe, and I'm sure they'll be able to fine-tune a model that would fit Air Liquide's profile. So at the end of the day, it is an issue of willingness and true commitment, I believe.
Great, thanks, Jon. Now, for anyone who would like to dig deeper into the research we presented today, you'll be able to find the links to the Air Liquide and the deep sea mining report in the chat. The EU comparison, the EU-US comparison report will be available later this week, so we can't share the link with that today. If you and your team are looking at any of these topics and would like to learn more, please do reach out to us. As part of our work, we offer deep dive sessions to investors on each of the reports, and we're happy to answer any questions. And just quickly before we wrap up this webinar, just a quick overview on what else we have recently published and what to expect. So alongside the Air Liquide climate transition analysis, we recently published the analysis report on Dow. So feel free to have a look at that on the website, or you can scan the QR code. I also wanted to mention the seafood database, which has been expanded to cover 300 corporates along the global seafood supply chain, providing investors with a tool to identify those most exposed to overfishing, illegal fishing, and other sustainability risks. And lastly, in terms of an outlook of what's to come, we'll soon be releasing the climate transition analysis on BASF, so similar to the ones you've seen today on Air Liquide and the one on Dow that you can see on your screen. And with that, so that brings the end of our update. Thank you very much for joining us, and please do reach out if we can be of any help. We look forward to seeing you in the new year, and have a wonderful rest of the year, and speak soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.